All right. Good morning, everyone. Let me see here and make sure that my volume is working. All right. I decided I'm going to make some more videos of the lecture and go ahead and load them up so you can look at them. And I'm having more remote students, or having more live students go remote due to quarantine. So I'm just going to go and make some and put them on there. Okay. You are responsible for this information. Roger that. Let's go ahead and get rolling. This is epidemiology and infectious diseases. What is epidemiology? Basically, it's a study of who gets a disease, what disease do they get, why do they get it, and how do we stop them from getting it? So, what do they get, who gets it, how we stop them from getting it. That is essentially what epidemiology is. All right, this is a long explanation for what I just explained to you. Okay, it's a study of health problems. You know, who gets sick, where they get sick from, how do we keep them from getting sick? We'll talk more about that here in just a second. Epidemiology is the scientific method of problem solving by using disease detectives, which are epidemiologists. You can have epidemiologists that work for the state. You can have epidemiologists that work for the county, the federal government, and so there's many different ways that epidemiologists can be used. Along with physicians, statisticians, laboratory workers, all these people make up the public health professionals. So when you have an outbreak somewhere of something, say let's take E. coli for example, you have an outbreak of E. coli, the epidemiologists go out to site, they investigate who's getting sick, what's causing them to get sick. Is there any correlation to any of the patients? Is there any commonalities? Did patients A and patient B eat at the same restaurant? If so, then we focus our investigation at the restaurant. Okay, and then we used all this information to determine the cause of the outbreak. The 5 W's in epidemiology. Excuse me. What is the diagnosis? What are people getting sick from? What is causing these people to get sick? Who's getting sick? Is it predominantly younger people? Is it predominantly older? Is it a mixture? Is it just anyone? Okay. Where are they getting sick? Is it due to contamination in a community? Is it due to a foodborne pathogen at a local restaurant? So we need to use all the evidence we have to try and figure out where these people are getting sick. We figure out where they're getting sick, we have a greater chance at stopping why people are getting sick. When? What's the time frame? Are we seeing them clustered together, or are we seeing the inoculation period being spread very wide? Okay. So once again, what's the time frame of these people getting sick? Why and how? What's the cause? How are these people getting sick? Are they eating tainted lettuce? Are they drinking unpasteurized apple juice, orange juice, etc.? And and so we need to figure out mode of transmission. And then finally, risk factors. Are people more prone to get this because maybe they're immunocompromised? If it has to deal with something like a COPD, is it because they are a lifelong smoker? So what are the risk factors here? Excuse me. The epidemiological triangle. We start at the top, the host. Who is the host? We base this off of several things: the patient's age, their sex, their race, previous diseases. Are they immunocompromised? Should we? Is that something we should look at? Do they have autoimmune diseases? What's the religious customs? We saw this when we saw Ebola, and we talked about Ebola in Africa. Their religious custom is to prep the body for burial so their loved one doesn't come back and haunt them. All right, so it's steeped in witchcraft, but that's their culture. And so that was also one of the things that was causing Ebola to spread so rapidly, because the virus in all the waste and in the body is extremely virulent. All right. Occupation. Is their job making them sick? Now, we all hear, man, I'm so sick and tired of my job. That's not what I'm talking about. If people work at factories, it could be caused the fumes, stuff like this. So is their job making them sick? Marital status. This plays a role, especially when we're talking about STDs. If you have someone who is positive for an STD, but they've been faithful the entire time, well, now we look at the spouse. Is the spouse having an affair? Has the spouse had affairs with people that have STDs? All right. Family background. Then we go down to agent. Is it biological? Is it chemical? Is it physical in nature? Is it stemming from trauma? Or is it nutritional? Okay, we see this in patients that are malnourished, or we see this in patients that suffer from eating disorders, okay, because they are also have a tendency to be extremely malnourished. The environment, the temperature, humidity, altitude of the place of where people are getting sick. Is it crowded housing? Is it more of a urban setting where people live very close together in communities? We saw this during in the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution took place. You had urbanization. You had people moving from the rural setting to the urban setting to work at factories. The problem here was this also gave rise to what we know as the slums. People living, 10, 12, 15 people living in a one-bedroom house. One person gets sick, chances are everyone's going to get sick. All right. So people just living in close proximity can cause them to get sick if one person gets it. Okay. Water, milk, food. We saw this in upstate New York a few years ago when we had a bunch of children getting sick with E. coli. Well, the epidemiologists trying to figure out why are predominantly the children getting sick. In their investigations, they traced it back to all these children had one thing in common. They all visited an apple orchard in upstate New York. And what's one drink that mostly children drink is apple juice. Here's the problem. The apple juice they got from the orchard was unpasteurized. So it hadn't gone through the pasteurization process of killing all the bad bacteria. Okay. So these kids were drinking this apple juice that unfortunately had been contaminated with E. coli. All right. So that was what gave rise to the E. coli outbreak in upstate New York a few years ago. The radiation, pollution, and noise. If we see a bunch of employees suffering from hearing disorders and they all work at the same place, could it be something there that is causing them to suffer hearing disorders? Okay. Hopefully by this time, we understand the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic. An epidemic is we have a specific disease or illness making a large group of people sick in one area. Okay. So, for example, when we talk about Ebola, the first outbreak, it made a lot of people sick in Yambuku, Zaire, and just in the surrounding villages. Okay. But it did not spread further. Then we have a pandemic, what we see with our current COVID situation. It's multiple people getting sick over many countries or continents, and multiple people were getting sick on those continents and or countries as well. Okay, that's what we're seeing. We saw it originally start in Wuhan, China. Then we saw it spread over to Europe, really hitting Italy very hard, and then also over here in the United States. Now in Europe, we're starting to see what we believe is maybe a second wave of it hitting. Now, if you look at viruses, look at the influenza outbreak of 1918. It had a high spike, and then it had a relapse a few months later. Okay, hopefully that's all we're seeing with COVID. Hopefully it's going to follow the same pattern as the great influenza pandemic of 1918. It's going to spike, decrease. We'll see a small little spike in a second wave, and then it will slowly go away. That's what I'm hoping for. One of the first main epidemics that hit in the world was the Black Death, the bubonic plague in 1347. Now, I'm sure we all heard the nursery rhyme that is actually comes from the Black Death. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. This is about the bubonic plague. In 1347, a boat docked in Sicily, and people standing on the harbor were horrified by what they saw. What they saw was a lot of people get off the boat, and they were covered in all these black pus-filled sores that covered their entire bodies, and what they start calling it was the Black Death, because the lesions on their body were black in nature from all the dried up blood, but also their skin kind of almost had a blackish tint to it. Okay. Most sailors aboard the ships were dead, and those still alive were gravely ill and covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Okay, this is where the black comes in. Bubonic plague is known as Yersinia pestis. It's a very virulent rod-shaped bacterium. It disables the immune system by injecting toxins into the defense cells, such as macrophages and lymphocytes that are tasked with detecting bacterial infections. Once these cells are knocked out, the bacteria can multiply unhindered. Okay, so once it goes in and injects its toxins to all these, then basically it runs rampant through the body, and it will take over. For many years, rats were thought to have been the cause of bubonic plague, but then something interesting happened. Bubonic plague occurred in places where this specific rat, the brown rat, didn't live. So if it's being carried by brown rats, why are people getting it in places that don't have brown rats? Come to find out, it's not the rats, it's the fleas that live on the rats. And fleas are very, what's the word for this? They can withstand a lot. It takes a lot to kill a flea. Okay, so therefore what's happening is, yes, fleas are on the rats, but once the rats come in contact with humans, the fleas jump off, will get on humans. Humans walk different places, fleas jump. Okay, so therefore, all these fleas were going to places that brown rats necessarily weren't, because they're being carried by humans. You know, such places that, you know, that have extreme cold, where the brown rat just doesn't live, they were getting cases of bubonic plague, and that's because the fleas did survive. There are two forms of plague. There's bubonic plague and pneumonic plague. Bubonic is the earliest form, and it involves swollen lymph nodes. It could be in the armpit, in the groin, in the neck. Very, very painful. Then you can start to get these sores on your body that are filled with pus, filled with blood. They start oozing and leaking, and this is what gave the Black Death its name. And the initial symptoms of this early stage are vomiting, nausea, fever, and fatigue. Then it progresses into the second stage, the pneumonic stage. This is when plague becomes airborne, becomes aerosol. So basically, I can cough, the water droplets expelled from my lungs and my mouth are carried into the air, and if anyone is around, it can get into their lungs, and it causes a respiratory illness. Okay, this causes respiratory plague, also known as pneumonic plague. If untreated, bubonic plague can then progress into what is called septicemic plague. This is when it, just like the first part, septic. So if we take the emic off, it's septic. Blood is contaminated. You're highly sick, and if plague moves into septicemic plague, it is 100% fatal. There is no recovery from this. So we have the three stages: bubonic, pneumonic, and then septicemic. This little image here, this is from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This takes place during the Black Death, and people, this guy, he's saying, bring out your dead, and people are bringing their dead bodies out, throwing them on the cart. All right, if you haven't seen it, check it out. It's a funny movie. It's British comedy, so you have to like British comedy to really understand it, but it's pretty good. No one knew exactly how bubonic plague was transmitted, so they didn't know how one person got it from another. Let me read to you what one person says. Instantaneous death occurs when the aerial spirit escaping from the eyes of the sick man strikes the healthy person standing near and looking at the sick. So they believe that even just looking at someone sick with bubonic plague and sick and dying from bubonic plague, that once that person breathes their last breath, bubonic plague will shoot out of their eyes and from their body, and that sickness will go into someone that's just looking on. Okay, so we're steeped in superstition here. Okay, so physicians relied on very crude measures such as bloodletting and leeches and boil lancing. Even our first president, George Washington, he got ill on, I believe it's December 14th, 1799. He was out working in the field, got caught in a rainstorm, and developed an infection. Well, they weren't sure what the infection was. So what they did was they started bloodletting. They would come in and they would cut him on different parts of his body and let his body bleed, hoping that this pathogen in his blood would leave as the blood is leaving his body. Okay, now they didn't cut arteries or anything. They would cut veins and stuff to try and get that blood out. Very painful and not effective. They did this on George Washington for 2 days until December 16th, I believe, 1799. He finally told him, stop, just stop. I'm done. This hurts. It's not doing anything. Just let me die. And that's what happened. About 4 hours later after that, he passed away. Most doctors and most historians believe that he actually died of what's called epiglottitis. So an inflammation of the epiglottis in the throat that covers the esophagus. And the trachea. So it suffocated him. When all is said and done, between 75 and 200 million people are suspected of dying of the Black Plague, Black Death. Staggering numbers. And that took place in 7 years. We're not talking something happening over 20 to 50 years. We're talking about a 7-year period. That's a staggering number when you break it down. In 1854, a cholera outbreak occurred in a London suburb known as Soho. And a young physician by the name of John Snow, no, not Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, but Dr. John Snow, he thought something was interesting about this cholera outbreak. And it's going to lead him down a path that would make him known as the father of modern day epidemiology. He had a practice in Soho. And what he would do was he had all these people coming to him suffering from cholera. And in this particular area, around 600 people had died of cholera. And the prevailing theory was that people were getting sick because of pollutants in the air. Remember, this is in the height of the Industrial Revolution. And people were getting sick because of all the pollutants being put into the air from the factories. Josh Snow's like, that's not how cholera works. That's not how this is working. It's a gastrointestinal infection. It's not a respiratory infection. And so he started doing some investigating, and he started plotting on a map where all these cholera outbreaks were occurring. And they all surrounded one particular area in Soho. The Broad Street water pump. All these cases of cholera that were coming to him, showing up in his office, surrounded the Broad Street water pump. And what he did is he went to the health officials there in London and said, here's the problem. It's this contaminated water pump. People are getting their water from it, but it's contaminated with cholera, and it's causing all this gastrointestinal illness and pain. Health officials mocked him. They said, no, this isn't true at all. There's no evidence or proof of this. And he said, do me a favor. Take the handle off the pump. If we see cases drop, we know it's the water pump. If they don't, I'm wrong and I'll apologize. So they said, okay, we'll prove you wrong. And they took the handle off the water pump. Well, shortly after them taking the handle off the water pump, cholera cases dropped dramatically. And he was right that people from the water that were using this water pump was the one causing people to get sick. So they replaced the water pump and they put a new handle on it, and the people were able to get clean water again. And he was proven right. The Great Influenza Pandemic of 1918, also known as the Spanish flu. It is estimated that about 500 million, or 1/3 of the world's population, became infected with the Spanish flu. That's a lot of people. The number of deaths was estimated to be at least 50 million worldwide, with around 675,000 occurring in the United States. Now, these numbers aren't 100% accurate for a couple of reasons. Number one, we were in the middle of World War I. All right. And so there was a lot of disinformation going on because they didn't want the enemy to know. All right. So a lot of accurate numbers weren't being shared. Another reason is just poor record keeping. It was hard to keep records while all this is going on, and you'll understand why here in a few minutes. What was odd about the Spanish flu was that typically when we talk about H1N1 flu, the normal flu, we see two groups being affected the most: those that are really young and those that are really old. Those are the groups that suffer the greatest risk of the flu, at least of dying of the flu or getting severely ill from the flu. But the Spanish flu was different. We saw the people dying the most in the age range of 20 to 40. That age range where typically people aren't getting very, very ill from the flu. But in this case, they were. And that's what struck people really odd about this, is that why are people in the healthiest prime of their life dying of Spanish flu? And we'll talk about that. The Spanish flu lowered the average life expectancy by 12 years. That is huge. Not since then, and not any time before, had our life expectancy been lowered by that much. Right now, I think life expectancy for a male is around 76, 77, 78. For a female, I think it's like 78 to 80. But at the time, let's use a nice round number of 60. Let's say it was 60. Okay, so it lowered the life expectancy to 48. And I'm 46 right now. So if I lived back then, I would literally have 2 years. And if I lived past 2 years, hey, I beat the life expectancy. All right. So I would be getting my affairs in order just in case it happened. All right. Where does Spanish flu originate? Well, there's several prevailing theories about this. Let's start with the first. Um, Many people believe that could have started at Fort Riley in Kansas. It could have started in Britain as well with British officers and soldiers there in Britain. But lately, there's been a breakthrough. They believe that many scientists believe that the Spanish flu originated in northern China. Odd how that happens. Where have I heard that one before? And here's why. What was happening was in France and Britain, men were off fighting World War One. They brought Chinese laborers in to work in London and in France to do the things that still had to get done. But because the British men and Frenchmen were out fighting the war, they didn't have anyone to do it. So British laborers were brought in to do this. Well, it's believed that many of these Chinese laborers were ill with Spanish flu, and that's what caused it to spread. The Spanish flu is actually an ancestor of what we deal with now, the H1N1 virus. And don't be confused, there's a chance that given any mutation that we could see this again. Now I'm talking with COVID, I'm talking about with influenza. All it takes is a certain mutation, and we'll talk about the mutations here later. How did it become known as Spanish flu? How did they get labeled with this horrible illness? Here's how. Remember, we are fighting World War One, and as you fight a war, you try to keep certain information from falling into the hands of your enemy, and so our numbers of those getting sick and dying were classified. No one wrote about this disease here in America. No one wrote about this infection because they didn't want the enemy finding out about this, saying, "Oh, they're sick. They're sick with this. Let's strike them harder." Same with Britain and France. They're involved in this as well, the World War One. So they're not going to publish about this. Spain, however, was not involved in World War One. So Spanish reporters were reporting on this new disease that was affecting people in Spain. But what they didn't realize, it was affecting people all over. It was affecting people in Americas, in Britain, in France, as well, in Italy. But they didn't know that. So they wrote about this new illness in very graphic and gory detail. And so people started calling it the Spanish flu because they were under the assumption that it was only in Spain. All right. So they're the ones that got labeled with it. Look on this flyer. I find this very interesting. Where have I seen that before? When all was said and done, more U.S. soldiers died from the 1918 Spanish flu than actually died in battle. It's believed that 40% of the U.S. Navy were infected with Spanish flu. And as far as the Army, 36% were infected with Spanish flu. All right, so those are huge numbers. And people were getting on boats ill, and they just spread the virus. See here, this picture of them walking down. I believe this is in New York City, and they're wearing masks as well. These are called doughboys, if you didn't know. Look at the hat. Hopefully you learned that in history. Look at this chart. I'll move my face out of the way. This shows the height of the pandemic here in October, November of 1918. Then we see a drastic spike downward. Then we see a little spike back again here in the spring months of 1919. It levels off, and then we see a small little rise of it again in coming out of winter, going into early spring of 1920, and then it falls off and goes away. The death toll is estimating anywhere from between 20 million and 50 million people worldwide. There's some people that actually believe the numbers are more around 100 million. Once again, it was hard to keep accurate numbers at this time. There's just so many deaths occurring. It was hard to really keep track. But they believe that 3% of the world population had died of the Spanish flu. Funeral homes were overrun. Funeral homes right now is places to bury people. So family members were having to bury their own family members. That's hard. Years later, in 2008, it was discovered that people weren't dying of influenza. They weren't dying of the Spanish flu. What happened was the Spanish flu actually created a way in the respiratory department, created a way that you would actually get sick with bacterial pneumonia, and that's how you died. The virus weakened a victim's bronchial tubes and lungs and cleared the way for bacterial pneumonia. This is how people died. They necessarily didn't die because of influenza, they died of bacterial pneumonia, secondary to the Spanish flu. AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. You all watched the documentary, and we talked about it in our group chat of about the beginnings of AIDS in America. In 1980, in San Francisco and in LA, Dr. Michael Gottlieb started seeing healthy men coming in with diseases that healthy men don't get. They don't get pneumonia, especially this pneumocystis, this particular type of pneumonia, and their immune systems were extremely weak. He published a report that went to the CDC, and CDC then published it about 5 previously healthy homosexual men who had been infected with pneumocystis pneumonia, which is typically caused by a harmless fungus, but it was not harmless in this case. But because their immune systems were so compromised, it became very deadly. This was the beginning of what became one of the world's worst pandemics in history, and it's still going on. There is no end in sight. We talked a little bit about Guyton Dugas, the French-Canadian flight attendant who was wrongfully labeled as patient zero, that he was the cause of the AIDS epidemic in America. And as we know now, that is not true. And he would die in 1984, and I think he was 32 or 33, I think, when he died. And he, up to that point, and I'd share this number with you, and it's a staggering number, that up to his time of his death, he had claimed that he had sex with over 2,500 men. Okay, and that's a lot. That's a lot by any standard. And so they labeled him as patient zero. And as we know, that was not correct. There was a transcription problem that it was actually an O in front of his name, but they believed it was zero, and they interpreted it as patient zero, when in reality, all it meant was he was outside of California. All right, that he was outside where they believed it started. So, but it got translated into zero, and that's how he got labeled as patient zero. The following year, New York Times published an alarming article about the new immune system disorder. By that time, had affected 335 people, killing 136 of them. Because the disease appeared to affect mostly homosexual men, officials initially called it gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID. Then females started getting sick. And this is really what opened up the eyes to a lot of people that, wait a minute, something's going on. Either these women are IV drug users, or they're getting it somewhere else. And sure enough, they were getting it from blood transfusions. You go into the hospital and you have a surgical procedure done. You need extra blood, and they would give you blood, but their screening at the time of the blood was not screening for HIV, because there was no such thing as HIV at the time. And all the filtering systems that are being used by all the blood banks, the virus is too small for the filtering system, so it's just going right through it. It was also AIDS is also known as the gay plague for many years. In September 1982, the CDC used the term AIDS to describe the disease for the first time. And like I said, there was a battle over who founded it, and Peter Piot and others. It was a mess, involved in many different lawsuits. Here's the face of AIDS. Here's some of the people that AIDS has claimed the life of. As a documentary talked about, we have Rock Hudson here, Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen, Eazy-E, the lead singer and rapper of NWA, Robert Reed, who is also known as the Brady Bunch dad. He was homosexual, no one knew it, and he died of AIDS as well. Ryan White was a hemophiliac who had a blood transfusion, and he got it. He was one of the big rallying cries in the 80s and 90s surrounding HIV. He became friends with Michael Jackson, Elton John, and Elton John actually sang at his funeral when he passed away. Now, Magic Johnson, as we know, he has not died. He has HIV, not AIDS. And Charlie Sheen down here, an actor as well, he came out a couple years ago saying that he had tested positive for HIV as well. I'm going to stop there for today, and we'll pick this up next time. All right. We'll talk later. I hope everyone has a great day.